Something that has been building quietly for weeks is about to become impossible to ignore. And the next few days may reveal why you have felt mentally and emotionally suspended in a story that never seemed able to reach its conclusion. On Sunday, August 9th, Mercury finally leaves Cancer and enters Leo, and in this case the sense of finally matters because Mercury has remained in Cancer since June 1st, keeping you inside the same emotional landscape for more than 10 weeks. Think about what that may have felt like from the inside. A conversation that seemed finished somehow returned to your mind. A feeling you thought you understood became complicated again. A memory resurfaced and demanded another look. You may even have known that there was something important you wanted to express, yet every time you tried to define it, the right language seemed to disappear. The thought was there, the emotion was there, but the sentence itself would not fully form. That experience has a reason, because Mercury has not simply been moving normally through Cancer during this period. It has been repeatedly traveling across the same territory, forcing the mind to reconsider material that could not yet be resolved. What matters now is that this repetition is ending, but the message waiting on the other side may reach you differently from what you have imagined. Even more importantly, the first few hours after Mercury changes signs could feel unexpectedly uncomfortable, and there is a specific reason for that, which I will explain later. Before we can understand that moment, though, you need to see the entire path Mercury has taken. Because August 9th only makes sense when you understand why the previous weeks have felt like being caught inside an emotional circle. Mercury stationed retrograde on June 29th while moving through Cancer, and it remained retrograde until July 23rd. When Mercury finally turned direct, the process was still not complete. It then had to move forward across the same degrees it had already traveled, and the post-retrograde shadow continued until August the 6th, which was literally yesterday. So the feeling of returning to familiar thoughts was not simply psychological imagination. In the technical astrological sense, Mercury was moving forward, reversing direction, and then advancing once again across the same section of Cancer. Mercury governs communication, thought, language, speech, and messages, while Cancer brings attention toward memory, family, belonging, emotional security, and the experiences that live nearest to the heart. Put those two energies together, and you can understand why the past may have seemed unusually loud. Perhaps certain conversations kept repeating themselves, even when you believed there was nothing more to discuss. Perhaps memories appeared without warning and carried emotions that surprised you. Perhaps your mind returned to something that happened months ago, or even years ago, and you found yourself examining it from another angle. None of that was meaningless within the symbolism of this transit. Mercury was crossing and recrossing one of the most emotionally sensitive landscapes of the zodiac, asking the mind to revisit what the heart had not completely processed. That can create a strange inner tension because part of you wants an answer, while another part is still discovering what the question really means. You can recognize something intellectually and still need time before your emotions catch up with that recognition. You can believe you are ready to speak, and then realize that what you actually need is another layer of understanding. That is why this period could have felt frustrating. The repetition was not necessarily producing an immediate conclusion. It was deepening your awareness of what had been sitting underneath the words. I have noticed this in myself as well. During the past several weeks, there were moments when I caught my mind returning to the same idea again and again, almost as though it was searching for the missing ending of a sentence. The thought would come close to completion, then turn back into itself before reaching the point. That experience captures the nature of what Mercury in Cancer has been doing. It has been reconsidering, editing, reviewing, and emotionally processing what was already present, but the final expression was not ready to emerge. Sometimes the deepest realization does not arrive as a sudden answer. Sometimes it develops through repetition until you finally understand why you could not move past the subject in the first place. Now that process reaches a turning point, because Mercury is ready to leave the private emotional chamber of Cancer and enter the expressive territory of Leo. On Sunday at 4:30, for those of you in Central Europe, Mercury crosses into Leo, and this is the moment to notice because the atmosphere changes with that transition. Cancer tends to keep experience close. It processes privately. It creates the inner room where you sit with what you feel, protect what is vulnerable, and wait until you understand your emotional truth before exposing it to the outside world. Leo moves differently. Leo brings what has been hidden inside into visibility. It represents the stage, the place where you step forward and allow yourself to stand behind what you know. If Cancer asks you to understand what your heart is protecting, Leo asks whether you are willing to give that understanding a voice. This is why Mercury entering Leo carries more meaning than simply becoming more talkative. It introduces the question of authorship. Are these truly your words? Are you willing to claim them? Can you stop communicating through hints, unfinished signals, and careful circles around the real subject? Can you speak without waiting for every person around you to approve of what you have discovered? Mercury in Leo brings warmth, creativity, confidence, and conviction into communication. And that conviction can make people pay attention because the words are no longer detached from the person speaking them. They carry presence. They carry ownership. They come from someone who has spent enough time inside the experience to know what it means. And this is exactly why this particular entrance into Leo has such weight. Mercury is not arriving here after a simple passage through Cancer. It is coming out of more than 10 weeks of emotional examination. Every conversation that returned during the Cancer retrograde, every feeling that refused to disappear, every private realization that became clearer through repetition has been part of that process. What could not be expressed earlier may now be ready to become language. What remained internal can begin moving outward. What you kept revisiting may finally reveal what it was trying to teach you about your own emotional truth. There is a profound difference between speaking because you need immediate relief and speaking because you have finally understood what you need to say. The previous weeks have been about the second kind of preparation. Mercury has remained inside that private Cancerian room since June 1st, sorting through memory, emotion, belonging, safety, and the conversations attached to them. On August the 9th, that room opens into Leo. The messenger, who has spent weeks reconsidering the same material, now walks onto the stage carrying words that have already survived review, revision, and emotional honesty. That is the deeper shift taking place here. You are not simply being encouraged to talk more loudly. You are reaching the point where something that has been forming privately may finally become clear enough to be spoken with confidence. And understanding what happens immediately after that door opens is where the next part of this story becomes especially important. If something inside you recognized itself in everything we just explored, pay very close attention now, because the moment Mercury finds its voice again may not begin with comfort. It may begin by touching exactly the place you would normally rather protect. That is the unexpected part of this transition, because the first expression of this new Mercury in Leo energy may carry an emotional edge, and understanding why requires looking at what happens immediately around the sign change. Mercury does not simply leave Cancer and arrive in Leo without interruption. Roughly 2 hours before Mercury enters Leo, it perfects a quincunx with the true North Node, and then, early the following morning, Mercury at 0 degrees Leo forms a square with Chiron at 0 degrees Taurus. Those aspects may sound technical when you hear them together, but the emotional story underneath them is remarkably personal. The quincunx with the North Node behaves like a final adjustment made just before you cross a threshold. Imagine reaching the doorway of a completely different chapter and suddenly realizing that something about the direction you are taking no longer fits the person you are becoming. Before the words leave your mouth, something has to be recalibrated. Before you move forward, You may have to notice whether the story you are preparing to tell still belongs to you. This aspect asks you to examine the motivation underneath your communication. Are you expressing something because it reflects what you genuinely know to be true? Or are you repeating the version that has always made you feel emotionally protected? That distinction matters now because carrying an old script into a new phase can keep you psychologically connected to the very cycle you are trying to leave. The North Node quincunx creates that final moment of adjustment, almost as though your internal compass is being corrected before Mercury steps into the visibility and confidence of Leo. Then the Chiron square arrives, and this is where the emotional temperature rises. Chiron represents one of the most sensitive territories in astrology, the place connected with deep vulnerability, old wounds, and the complicated process of healing something that may become wiser and more integrated without ever feeling completely erased. Within hours of Mercury entering Leo, Mercury squares Chiron, and that timing gives the beginning of this transit a very specific emotional quality. The first honest words that emerge may touch something tender. A conversation may reach a subject you normally avoid. You may hear something that lands more deeply than expected, or you may discover that saying what you actually mean requires exposing a part of yourself that you have spent considerable energy protecting. The discomfort does not automatically mean that the message is incorrect. It may exist precisely because the message reaches something real. There are truths that are easy to speak because they cost us nothing emotionally. And then there are truths that make the voice unsteady because speaking them means allowing another person to see what matters. This Mercury and Chiron contact belongs to that second territory. So if the opening days of Mercury in Leo bring you close to a sensitive emotional point, and if you notice hesitation precisely when you are about to express something meaningful, do not immediately interpret that reaction as evidence that you should retreat. Vulnerability can feel remarkably similar to danger when you've spent a long time protecting a wound. The nervous system may want to pull backward even while another part of you knows that the conversation matters. The significance of the message may be inseparable from the tenderness it exposes. This is not about being punished for speaking. It is about discovering that some of the most important communication requires enough courage to remain present when the truth touches a vulnerable place. And there is very little time to remain still once this begins, because Mercury moves rapidly into a sequence of major aspects during the following 2 weeks, and every one of them changes the tone of the unfolding message. On August 11th, Mercury opposes Pluto, and suddenly the conversation becomes deeper. Pluto does not favor the comfortable surface when something more powerful is operating underneath. Hidden material can rise. Secrets can become harder to contain. Power dynamics may become visible, and the unspoken meaning beneath the conversation can become more important than the words people have been using to avoid it. If there has been a subject nobody wanted to address because acknowledging it would require going somewhere emotionally intense, this opposition can create pressure for that material to finally enter the conversation. The experience may feel weighty, but it can also produce extraordinary clarity because once the hidden layer becomes visible, you are no longer trying to navigate around something you cannot name. Truth is not always gentle when it first appears, yet bringing it into the open can create the possibility of movement that secrecy and avoidance could not provide. Then, during that same night, Mercury forms a trine with Neptune, and the atmosphere changes again. After Pluto pulls attention toward what has been buried, Neptune opens the imaginative and intuitive channels for writers, musicians, artists, and anyone whose work depends on language, imagery, creativity, or inspiration. This can be an especially fertile current. An idea may appear with such fluidity that it seems to have arrived from somewhere beyond deliberate thought. Images, phrases, feelings, and creative connections can flow with unusual ease, creating the sensation that you are receiving something rather than constructing it piece by piece. But Neptune carries an important complication alongside that beauty. The same energy that dissolves creative barriers can also soften the boundary between intuition and assumption. Something can feel emotionally profound, spiritually resonant, and beautifully expressed while still lacking factual confirmation. So allow the inspiration to arrive. Record it. Write it down. Follow the feeling and preserve what comes through. But before turning that feeling into certainty, verify what can actually be verified. Emotional resonance and factual accuracy are not always the same thing, and remembering that distinction becomes important under Neptune. Then August 12th brings another change when Mercury forms a sextile with Uranus. This is where unpredictability enters the story. A message you were not expecting may appear. An insight can arrive so quickly that the entire situation suddenly looks different. You may find yourself saying something you had never planned to say, or hearing information that instantly redirects a conversation you thought you understood. Uranus can behave like a flash illuminating a dark room for a fraction of a second. Nothing in the room necessarily changed, but suddenly you can see what was already there. That sudden recognition can alter the direction of communication, because once a new perspective becomes visible, returning completely to the previous understanding may no longer be possible. And August 12th carries another major astrological event that requires precision, because this is also the date of a total solar eclipse in Leo. Mercury is indeed in Leo when this eclipse occurs, but that does not mean Mercury is conjunct the eclipse. Mercury is positioned around 5 degrees of Leo, while the eclipse occurs at 20 degrees of Leo, leaving approximately 15 degrees between them. They occupy the same zodiac sign, which means Mercury and the eclipse are co-present in Leo. But they are not sitting together at the same degree and should not be described as a conjunction. That difference may sound small if you are only listening for the sign involved, but astrologically it changes how the configuration should be understood. And that distinction becomes essential when we look at what Mercury is actually doing during this eclipse, and why its presence in Leo still matters, even without a conjunction. What makes this moment even more consequential is that the eclipse on August the 12th is not an isolated event. It opens an entirely new Leo eclipse series that continues unfolding through 2028, which means we're witnessing the first chapter of a much longer astrological narrative. Mercury happens to be traveling through Leo while that chapter begins, and that places the messenger inside the same symbolic landscape as the eclipse. Mercury gives words to what is becoming visible. It helps articulate the emerging themes of creativity, leadership, courage, self-expression, and personal identity. But precision matters here. Mercury is not creating the eclipse, and the eclipse is not producing Mercury's message. These are separate astrological movements occurring within the same developing story, and their simultaneous presence is exactly what gives this period so many layers. One event is illuminating a new Leo cycle, while the other is helping us name and communicate what that cycle is beginning to reveal. And once that opening has taken place, the energy does not simply disappear. It accelerates toward what may be the most concentrated and powerful stretch of this entire Mercury transit, from August the 13th through August 17th. If there is one window to watch especially closely, this is it, because Mercury moves through a sequence that takes the message from emotional truth into connection, expansion, and finally something capable of lasting. On August the 13th, Mercury forms a sextile with Venus, and after the intensity that has preceded it, communication gains softness, grace, and diplomacy. This is where truth can find a form that another person can actually receive. You are not necessarily changing what needs to be said. You are discovering how to express it without stripping away either its honesty or its humanity. Words can become easier to share and easier for others to relate to, because Venus brings harmony to Mercury's expression. If there is a difficult conversation that needs to happen, this is the day when the message may land most gracefully. If you are developing content, writing, presenting an idea, or making a pitch, this aspect can give your communication an attractive quality that naturally draws attention. There is something psychologically important about that shift, because being understood is not only about possessing the truth. Sometimes it depends on finding a form for that truth that allows another person to stay open long enough to hear it. Venus helps Mercury do exactly that. Then, August 15th arrives, and Mercury meets Jupiter in a conjunction in Leo. This is where everything becomes larger. Jupiter represents growth, expansion, reach, and amplification. So when it joins Mercury, whatever has been developing through the previous stages can suddenly gain volume. A thought that began privately can become something you publish. Personal understanding can become something you teach. A message that originally belonged to your own experience can reveal a meaning that speaks to many more people. An audience can expand. An idea can grow beyond its original dimensions. Something you expected to reach, only a small circle, may travel considerably farther. In Leo, that expansion carries visibility, which is why this conjunction can feel like the moment when the message steps fully into the light. But there is an essential warning inside that opportunity. Jupiter enlarges what it touches, and amplification does not automatically distinguish between something reliable and something exaggerated. If your message has substance, accuracy, and a grounded foundation, Jupiter can help extend its reach. If what you are communicating has been inflated, overstated, or never properly checked, Jupiter can enlarge that as well. Expansion itself is neutral in that sense. It increases the scale of what is already present. That means August 15th carries enormous potential, but the strength of that potential depends on whether what you are amplifying can support the attention it receives. This is not permission to promise more simply because confidence is high. It is an invitation to let something genuine become larger without losing contact with the truth that gave it value in the first place. Then, 2 days later, on August 17th, Mercury forms a trine with Saturn, and this is where the entire sequence gains structure. Saturn asks whether the message can survive after the excitement has passed. Inspiration can be beautiful, but Saturn wants to know what you are going to do with it. An announcement may sound powerful, but can it become a plan? A creative vision may feel extraordinary, but does it have enough structure to exist beyond imagination? Words may inspire commitment, but are you prepared to honor what those words require? Saturn represents structure and accountability, and under this trine it functions almost like a demanding editor examining everything Mercury has gathered. The idea may be compelling, but now it must be supported. The vision may be exciting, but now it needs a framework. The declaration may feel meaningful, but now it has to become something you can stand behind over time. This is the stage where language begins turning into commitment, and creative possibility develops the strength necessary to exist in the physical world. When you look at the entire progression, the story becomes remarkable in its coherence. Chiron first brings Mercury into contact with vulnerability and asks for the courage to communicate what is tender. Pluto then pulls the message beneath the surface and demands greater depth. Neptune opens imagination and intuition, allowing the vision to expand beyond ordinary thinking. Uranus introduces the unexpected insight that can redirect the entire conversation. Venus gives the message beauty, connection, and a form others can receive. Jupiter increases its scale and allows it to travel farther. Saturn finally asks whether what has been spoken can become durable. In just over a week, the message moves through vulnerability, depth, imagination, surprise, grace, expansion, and structure. That is why this transit feels less like a single astrological event and more like a complete narrative developing in real time. But this brings us to the question underneath everything we have been discussing. When we say that the message you have been waiting for is approaching, what are we actually talking about? It is important not to make this more mysterious than it needs to be, because Mercury governs very tangible forms of communication. The message could be literal, an email could arrive, a text could appear, someone may finally call. You could receive the reply that has been delayed, a contract, an offer, an announcement, or a piece of news after weeks in which nothing seemed to move. Mercury governs these exchanges, and Leo adds confidence and visibility, so a concrete development is absolutely part of the symbolism here. Yet the more profound possibility is that the message does not arrive from the outside at all. For many people, what changes may happen internally? After weeks of circling the same emotional material, you may suddenly understand what you have actually been trying to say. A decision you have repeatedly approached and retreated from since the middle of June may finally become clear enough to make. A creative idea that has spent weeks developing privately may reach the point where keeping it hidden no longer makes sense. You may discover the courage to name your identity without shrinking it for someone else's comfort, or to state what you need without immediately attaching an apology to the sentence. That internal shift can be just as significant as receiving an external answer, because sometimes the most exhausting form of waiting is not waiting for another person to respond. It is waiting for your own mind and heart to agree about what comes next. You can spend weeks believing that closure depends on someone else giving you the missing information, when what you are actually approaching is the moment when you become capable of giving language to something you already know. And this is the version of the message that feels especially meaningful to me, because sometimes what you have spent all this time waiting to hear was never meant to arrive through somebody else's voice. And this may be the realization that changes how you understand the entire journey, because the answer you have been waiting to receive may have been developing inside your own voice all along. During the retrograde, that voice became harder to hear as Mercury moved through Cancer, and your thoughts became intertwined with old emotions, memories, family matters, and everything connected with emotional security and belonging. For 10 weeks, the messenger remained behind closed doors, but silence did not mean nothing was happening. The message was taking shape throughout that entire period, and on August 9th, what has been forming privately becomes clear enough for you to finally give it a voice. This is where the transit becomes more than something interesting to observe astrologically, because you can work with it directly in your own life. Begin by looking back at what changed after July 23rd, when Mercury turned direct. Notice what started moving again. Remember whether a conversation found even part of its resolution, whether an uncertainty began losing its grip on you, or whether there was something you finally stopped reconsidering from every possible angle. Then look at what felt finished after August 6th, when Mercury completed the post-retrograde shadow. That was the final movement across the territory Mercury had been reviewing, so ask yourself what no longer feels unfinished. What question has stopped demanding the same amount of mental attention? What subject no longer produces the confusion it once did? What have you understood well enough that you no longer need to keep returning to it? And then comes the most important question of all. What can you say now that you genuinely could not say before? This is not about identifying the response that sounds appropriate, choosing whatever creates the least discomfort, or constructing a sentence simply because you believe other people want to hear it. The question is, what has become true enough inside you that you are finally prepared to put words around it? Somewhere beneath the mental noise, there may be a sentence that has been assembling itself slowly for weeks. Perhaps you have heard fragments of it when you were alone. Perhaps you have almost said it several times and then pulled back. Perhaps you did not yet understand why it mattered so much. Mercury, entering Leo, brings attention directly to that sentence, because this transit is not asking you to increase your volume merely so other people notice you. It asks you to communicate from a center you can actually stand inside. It favors language with warmth, creative courage, and enough integrity to remain meaningful even when someone challenges it. That is why this can represent something larger than an astrological change. It can describe a personal development in the way you relate to your own voice. If you have sensed pressure building around how you communicate, how openly you express yourself, or how confidently you allow yourself to be seen, that feeling may become especially noticeable now. Something is changing in the relationship between what you know internally and what you are willing to reveal externally. But there is an important caution as Mercury continues through Leo, because the later portion of this transit is not entirely effortless. Around August 19th through August 24th, several more difficult minor aspects enter the picture, and they can increase impatience, defensive responses, and the tendency for a story or message to become larger than the reality supporting it. Another temptation can emerge as well. Once you have declared something publicly, you may feel pressure to defend it simply because admitting that your understanding has changed feels uncomfortable. This is where the shadow side of Mercury in Leo needs to be recognized. At its strongest, this placement communicates with courage, creativity, generosity, and warmth. At its more difficult expression, confidence can harden into stubbornness. You can become so attached to your position that conviction starts masquerading as proof. You may speak over another person instead of listening to what they are actually saying. Disagreement can begin to feel like rejection, and useful feedback can be interpreted as a personal attack. That is why the period following the Jupiter peak on August the 15th deserves particular awareness. As your message grows, keep checking whether your capacity to listen is growing with it. Ask whether you can still revise your position when new information becomes available. Confidence does not require refusing to change. In fact, the ability to edit what you have said can reveal a deeper kind of confidence, because it means your identity is not dependent on defending every previous statement. The most effective communicator is not necessarily the person who dominates the room. It is the person who understands when the moment requires expression and when the message needs another revision. Mercury remains in Leo for approximately 2.5 weeks before entering Virgo on August 25th, and that transition changes the emphasis from declaration toward refinement. So this Leo period gives you a concentrated window to speak, create, express, and stand behind what has become clear. But courage works best when it remains connected to discernment. And when you step back and look at everything Mercury has traveled through, the larger story becomes visible. For more than 2 months, Mercury has occupied the same emotional landscape. The retrograde brought that territory back under examination. The shadow period carried the review through its final stage. Then, on August 9th, Mercury leaves that prolonged internal process and enters Leo, the territory of the storyteller, the leader, the creative force, and the voice capable of speaking from the heart with both warmth and authority. Chiron explains why the opening words can expose vulnerability. Pluto draws the communication toward deeper and more intense truths. Neptune opens the imaginative channel and can make inspiration feel almost impossibly beautiful. Uranus introduces the unexpected statement, realization, or message that can redirect everything without warning. Venus allows expression to become graceful enough to connect with other people. Jupiter expands the message and increases how far it can travel. Saturn gives that message the structure necessary to endure beyond the excitement of the moment. Seen together, these aspects describe something far richer than simply waiting for information to arrive. They describe a message moving through a complete developmental process. It emerges from vulnerability, enters deeper territory, receives inspiration, encounters surprise, discovers beauty, expands its reach, and finally develops enough structure to become real. Across these 2.5 weeks, you are watching the possibility of your own voice returning after one of the longest communication resets of the year. And perhaps That is the most extraordinary part of this entire story. What felt like silence may actually have been preparation. What felt like repetition may have been revision. What felt like confusion may have been the unfinished stage of understanding something that needed more time before it could become language. Now the private process reaches the point where expression becomes possible. So if you have stayed with me through this entire journey, thank you for giving this conversation your time and attention. If these themes have reflected what you have been experiencing and you want to continue exploring astrology this way, I would deeply appreciate you subscribing, because your support genuinely helps this content reach more people. And I especially want to hear from you in the comments. Think about these past several weeks and tell me what kept returning. Which conversation seemed unable to reach an ending? Which words repeatedly came close to being spoken, but never quite made it out? Most importantly, what feels different now, and what are you finally prepared to say? I read every comment, and there is something meaningful about recognizing how many of us can move through similar cycles while experiencing them through completely personal stories. Take good care of yourself, trust what has become clear, and I will see you in the next one.